Hey everyone, today we're going to be doing a weapon tier list, but this one is going to be a bit different. We're ranking every weapon in the game based on their difficulty. Now, Monster Hunter isn't a game like League of Legends, where you need to play 50 or more games with a single champion just to be decent with it. You can understand most of a weapon's moveset by just spending some minutes in a training area. That being said, there are weapons that are clearly harder to use than others, and as such, we're going to be talking about the differences. We will be ranking these weapons from simple to easy, medium, hard, and super hard. Keep in mind that this isn't about how easy or hard it is to master a weapon, but how easy it is for a player just picking it up to learn and use its moveset. And of course, this is all very subjective and you may disagree with me, and that is why I have you guys here to know if my opinion is too off base and if you guys agree with me or not. Starting with the sword and shield, it is a very accessible, definitely a good starting point for any hunter. It has a very low skill floor as it is a very fast weapon that has no commitment in most of its attacks, and so it allows you to get in and fast and dodge incoming attacks, and also you have a shield to block any sort of incoming damage. Plus you are also able to use consumable items without sheathing the weapon, which can come in handy especially if you are a newcomer, and in which case you may need to be healing more often than not. On the other hand, it has a very high skill ceiling, as some of the things you need to take into account are the invincibility frames for the perfect timing of the Shoryugeki, or you need to get the perfect rush timing right, and also you can start your combo from perfect rush with a backstab. You can also abuse the backstab to avoid incoming monster attacks. It does not have invincibility frames, but if you master the weapon, you'll be able to consistently use it to both dodge damage and also prepare your damage. Additionally, the sword and shield offers you two very different playstyles, one that is more reliant on sword combos and another one that is more focused on shield bashing and staggering the monster and KOing it. And if you don't like to stick to one playstyle, you can do what I do and weave in between those playstyles whichever way you feel is best for the situation you're in. The sword and shield is getting some really cool additions in Sunbreak, and it's going to make the weapon feel a lot better and also more fun to use. So I would put the sword and shield in the simple category, at least for now. Now the second weapon is the Greatsword. The Greatsword is a very simple, very straightforward, very honest weapon. It is of course a very slow weapon, but it teaches you about positional awareness. You're going to need to learn to read the monster to be able to land those meaty chops. And I think you'll also be able to learn about weak spots faster with the Greatsword, as you really need to make those hits count. After all, it is such a slow weapon and you spend so much time charging it up, and you use your wirebug skills just to get close to the monster to charge your weapon once again, that if you don't read the situation properly, you're just going to waste all your resources and miss, or you're going to just get hit while you're charging your weapon. Additionally, there are some other things you can master about this weapon, such as when to shoulder tackle and which switch skill you prefer, either rage slash or true charge slash, and how you go about using them. I believe the Greatsword sits at the very perfect difficulty. It's not too easy, not too hard for sure, very simple to understand, yet there are a lot of micro adjustments you can do to make yourself better at this weapon. So I would put Greatsword right in the middle in medium difficulty. Next up is the dual blades. They are quite simple as well, but I feel like it's not any easier. Maybe that's just me. They don't have a lot of reach, and they also lack in damage, so you need to find windows of opportunity between monster attacks or even during monsters' attacks to close in the distance and deal damage. Additionally, there is a lot of stamina management that goes into playing the dual blades, especially considering demon mode, where your stamina is constantly depleting, and if you're not careful, you won't have enough stamina to dodge an incoming monster attack. That being said, you have a lot of tools available at your disposal to allow you to dodge any sort of danger that comes your way. And with Feral Demon mode, you'll be able to damage the monsters while you're dodging and evading their attacks. Additionally, there is also a completely different playstyle that is available to you as a dual blade user, which is the aerial playstyle. It takes some time to get used to, but it allows you to be more aggressive, and it is a lot of fun. All in all, one of the greatest things about the dual blades is how easy it is to pick them up, and how you're able to constantly deal damage and stick close to the monster, which many other weapons may have difficulty doing. As such, I'm going to land the dual blades in the easy category. Next up is the longsword, a controversial weapon, and a bit of a curious case in my opinion. The consensus in the community is that longsword is overpowered, it has an overloaded kit, and that is for a good reason. It's got wide reach, big damage, it is quite fast, and a ton of moves with invincibility frames. You'll be able to parry and counter all sorts of attacks the monsters throw at you, and you won't even need wire bugs to do that. But hey, if your timing sucks, you can spend 2 wire bugs to basically become invulnerable for 2 seconds. The thing is, if you don't want to only rely on your wire bugs, you do need to take some time to practice and get used to the different timings of your invulnerabilities. You can still get away with not using any of the EI counters, and you may be able to just unga-bunga your way through it all. It can be easy to pick up and use, but arguably the strongest part of the longsword's kit is the part that requires the most practice. So if you can't use it, if you don't time the counters correctly, you're essentially only using half of the longsword's potentially, or even less. I'm not saying the longsword is hard, because it isn't, but it's not as easy as some players make it out to be in my opinion. So for that reason, I'm going to leave it in the easy category, but I may bump it up to medium later in the video. After that we have the bow, the first ranged weapon of the list. It is quite unique amongst the ranged weapons in that it functions best at a short to medium range, putting you at a bigger risk of getting hit, and since you're using a ranged weapon, you'll be taking extra damage. The difficulty of the bow comes in maintaining the perfect range to get the damage bonus, while also managing different coatings, all the while being decently good at aiming and not getting hit while you're doing all of this. There is quite a bit of micromanagement involved when it comes to the bow, as you need to manage your coatings and also your stamina, as each one of the dodges you perform cost quite a bit of stamina, and it is essential to keep that stamina up, because if you run out of it, you're going to be a sitting duck and it's going to be very easy for monsters to attack you, and again, because you're a ranged user, you're going to take a ton of damage. The bow is quite strong, one of the absolute strongest weapons in the game, for sure. But it's definitely not easy to use. Especially for newcomers, I would not recommend this weapon. So with that being said, I would put the bow in the hard difficulty. After that we have the Inset Glaive. I have a lot of personal attachment to the Inset Glaive, as it is the weapon that kickstarted it all for me in the Monster Hunter community. That being said, the Inset Glaive is quite a complex weapon, with the different extracts providing different buffs, knowing where you need to get those buffs and trying to maintain the buffs active at all times, in addition to knowing about Kinsect stats and also their dust types, which ones you prefer. It can be a lot to manage for a newcomer, and its complexity is exactly what drove me to the weapon back in Monster Hunter World. The combos themselves aren't too difficult, nothing special really, but it can take some time to get used to the Inset Glaive's high mobility both in the air and also on the ground, as you may accidentally run into attacks, or maybe you end up thinking that the stylish backflip has any invincibility frames. Spoilers, it doesn't really. I was thinking of putting the Inset Glaive in the very hard category, but because the combos are so simple and because in some encounters Using the Inset Glaive makes things so trivial, I would put this in the difficult category. Next up is the hammer, and I would say the hammer is around the same difficulty level as the Greatsword, maybe even a bit easier, as you can pretty much maintain the hammer in a charged state at all times, given that you have enough stamina. Plus, it doesn't require a lot of commitment, as you can roll cancel out of most of your attacks. That being said, Rise has added some complexity to the hammer that was, in my opinion, much needed. Now you have two different types of charge modes for the hammer, that being the strength mode and the charge mode, and swapping between these two modes also gives you super armor in your move. So it is important to know which mode is best for the situation you're in, and also know how to take advantage of that super armor you get when you change in between the two different forms. Having said all of that, I'm going to put the hammer in the easy category. Next on the list is the hunting horn. The hunting horn used to be one of the most, if not the most complex weapon in Monster Hunter, but that was until Rise that had the hunting horn receive a complete rework that changed the way it works for the most part. It is now easier than ever to perform melodies, and now hunting horn users have many more tools that help the hunting horn's lack of mobility. On top of that, you get a silkbind attack that has hyper armor that you can rely on if you're caught in a pinch. Many fans miss the complexity of the old hunting horn, but if you were afraid of it being too hard for you, it is now much easier to use in Rise. All you need to take into account are the different melodies and the different song effects and how to perform them, but because you have essentially a manual guide on screen at all times, it really isn't all that difficult. And hey, if you are to ever set foot into a multiplayer quest, then this is the perfect weapon to bring with you, as everyone is going to appreciate all of the hunting horn buffs. All in all, I would rate the hunting horn from Rise at an easy difficulty. And now we get to the switch axe, and this is where things start to get more difficult. The thing about the switch axe is, of course, that you get to switch between the axe mode and the sword mode. Now, switch axe is not as reliant on sword mode as it was back in Monster Hunter World or even the older titles. We now have a much better balance when it comes to those two, so it is important for you as a hunter to keep switching between these forms and to take advantage of each of their strong points. There are many things to know about the switch axe. You'll have to learn about the different file types and how they interact with your weapon and the monsters you hunt, how to manage your sword gauge and trying to get into the amped state. If you don't pay attention, you may end up swapping to sword mode when it's not ready, and you're gonna be stuck in that reload animation and you're gonna get slapped. In addition, you'll have to get used to not using dodge roll at all times, as when you are in axe form you can only perform a sidestep, and that can take a while to get used to. Of course, you can rely on skills such as Evade Extender to avoid that issue, but you would need to farm talismans in order to add that skill to your set. Additionally, a lot of optimal combos have you swapping back and forth between both modes. You can also rely on another skill, the Rapid Morph skill, to increase DPS as it drastically increases the speed and power of morph attacks, but it can be easier to mess up the combo as you have to do it faster. Overall, Switch Axe is one of the most difficult melee weapons in the game, although its combos are quite simple, quite basic even, unless you're trying to get optimal with it. This one is very difficult to choose, but I think I'm going to put Switch Axe into the hard difficulty. Not quite very hard yet. And of course, following the Switch Axe we have the Charge Blade, the other transforming weapon in Monster Hunter. Just like the Switch Axe, you'll have to swap between two different modes, Sword mode and the Axe mode. I feel like Charge Blade is significantly easier than the Switch Axe, but maybe that's because I've spent so much time with that weapon ever since 4 Ultimate. The Charge Blade is by no means a simple weapon. Understanding how to charge the files as well as the shield, the sword, it can all be overwhelming, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes second nature, because remember, for even charging the files there's a specific timing. You can undercharge it or even overcharge it. Then there's even guard points. If you switch forms at a specific moment as you're about to get hit by a monster, you'll be able to block the incoming damage and essentially parry the monster's attack. Mastering that is essential to being a Charge Blade hunter. There's also two different file types to take into account, those being the impact file type and the elemental file type, but those are pretty straightforward. As for playstyles, of course you can always do the old for you playstyle of spamming super amped elemental discharge or ultra amped elemental discharge, but that is no longer optimal. As a matter of fact, you'll need to rely a lot more on switching forms here. Or you will even need to use your amped axe mode to deal a lot of damage. One benefit of the Charge Blade is that it allows you to play pretty safe. You get a shield in sword mode, and you're also pretty mobile in that mode. And again, you have the guard points that, once you master the timing of, allow you to be extremely safe, having a Silkbind attack that is also a counter. More often than not, you're focused on charging the shield and possibly the sword and the axe as well, and then you focus on spending your files and finally go back to charging your files. There isn't a lot of swapping back and forth that is required, although cancelling your attacks into an elemental discharge can sometimes be the perfect tool to KO a monster. I have to emphasize that there is a lot to optimize on the Charge Blade, and once again, getting the hang of it can be quite difficult. I really do believe that you should look up a tutorial whenever you try to pick up the Charge Blade. Doing it through the training area alone can be quite gruesome. So with all of that, the Charge Blade is actually going to be the first weapon on the list taking the very hard spot. And now we have only 4 more weapons left. Let's continue with the lance. Honestly, I don't really know where to put the lance here because, well, it is quite a simple weapon with simple combos and button inputs, but at the same time, it requires a bit of precision. The lance is all about micro adjustments to either sidestep a monster's attack or to block it, counter it, and go back to poking. Although in Rise, you also have the possibility of essentially slapping the monster with your lance, and as it turns out, it's actually optimal to do that in a lot of times. So you can throw out a lot of the precision of the weapon here. In addition, it is probably the safest weapon in the game, given that its moveset and many of its Silkbind attacks revolve around guard. There is some stamina management that needs to be done, as constant guarding and evading will burn through your stamina quite fast, but that's, again, rather simple to do. For those reasons, I believe that, surprisingly, I'm going to put the lance in the very simple tier. If we were talking about lance in any other Monster Hunter game, I would have considered it harder to use, but it honestly requires zero effort to play lance in Rise. And of course, now we have the counterpart of the lance, the gun lance. It is fairly more complex than the lance, having 3 shelling types, normal, long and wide, those 3 being extremely different playstyles. Much like the lance, it is a very safe weapon, featuring what I believe to be the best shield in the game, and most of its attacks are low commitment with the exception of Wyvern Fire, Wyvern Stake, and I guess the long shelling playstyle. I don't really know if this should be taken into account, but the gun lance is pretty much the weakest weapon in the game, and will probably continue to be that in Sunbreak. I really doubt Capcom is going to do something to really change that in the expansion as much as I hope they do. If you like the gun lance, there's nothing wrong with using it. Personally, I think it's got a really fun and flashy moveset. Just keep in mind that you'll be dealing a lot less damage than other weapons, and there's also a lot of micromanagement that needs to be taken into account. So all of that can make things harder for you. In addition, the gun lance is a fairly immobile weapon, but it can be fixed with a Fate Extender. As I alluded to earlier, you will need to manage your shells and reload, and you can also burn through your sharpness fairly quickly, so you may need to sharpen more often than with other weapons. Because of all of those reasons, I think I'm going to put Gunlance in the hard category. Maybe it's because of the lack of the weapon's damage that I'm bumping it up to being difficult, but I really do feel like Gunlance belongs there. And much respect to any Gunlance main out there. And now we move on to the Bogans. The Bogans are definitely the two weapons that I've used the least, so apologies if I don't get everything right here. Starting with the Heavy Bogan, it is a fairly immobile weapon that has a shield, so you'll be able to be dishing out damage from a distance and relative safety. The fact that you're immobile is a problem, but thankfully it can be remedied by just nuking the monster very quickly. As expected, there is quite a bit of management that you need to take into account when picking up the Heavy Bogan. Thanks to the weapon's shield, you can play it somewhat similar to how you would play the Gunlance somewhat defensively, almost like a tank. Wyvern Heart would turn the Heavy Bogan into a machine gun, while Wyvern Snipe would turn it into more of a sniper, as the name would indicate. All of these modifications are things that you change before a hunt, so you may not need to interact with some of them if you simply don't like them. There is also some additional skill ceiling in the form of counter shot fire, which, as the name would imply, is a counter that you can perform for some crazy damage. Overall, not a very difficult weapon to use, but a weapon that is somewhat difficult to optimize. All in all, I would put the Heavy Bogan in the medium difficulty. Lastly, we have the Light Bogan. As the name would imply, it is a much more agile and mobile counterpart to the Heavy Bogan. Once again, managing your aim and ammunition is essential to playing the Light Bogan, but there is quite a bit of skill expression in the form of Quick-Step Evade, and also Fanning Vault or Fanning Maneuver, all of which allow you to be extremely mobile with the weapon, to the point where you would be able to dodge incoming attacks and also be able to damage the monster at the same time. Of course, in order to offset all of these benefits, you're going to be dealing a lot less damage when compared to the Heavy Bogan. But the Light Bogan is not a weak weapon by any means. I would argue that it's actually a very strong weapon. But because of all of these tools available at its disposal, and because it is much easier to use than the Heavy Bogan, at least in my opinion, I would rate the Light Bogan at an easy difficulty. And that has been me ranking all of the weapons in Monster Hunter Rise from easiest to hardest. I'm still not sure 100% about some of these placements, but I feel like I would always feel this way about certain weapons, because there's always something more to master, and that's the cool thing about Monster Hunter. Most of the weapons are no longer the simple ways that they were back in the old generations. And while some may miss those older forms of the weapons, having so much skill expression can make the game much more enjoyable as you discover a new weapon that you fall in love with as you learn its different combos and how to optimize everything about it. That is one of my favorite things about Monster Hunter. But let me know how you guys feel about these weapons and how I rank them here. I'm certainly going to disagree with a lot of you, so I'm curious as to how you would rank them. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Dark Hero, and happy hunting.